Cynical reason may be explained in terms of sociology of emotions as a consequence of background emotional calibration of the socially situated self, guided by feelings of comfortable continuity. They know that in their activity they are following an illusion, but still they are doing it. And I like this concept of the cynical reason because it captures the as-if element of social behavior and social reality. Cynical reason is thus an element that is probably fundamental to human existence, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Yet sometimes it paves the way for banal evil and also for, when it comes to the legal system, decreasing legitimacy. And I did research at one of the departments of the Swedish Migration Board, which was populated by young cosmopolitan employees, all in favor of multiculturalism and migration and so on. And I found that quite intriguing because their main occupation was really rejecting asylum seekers. So I tried to use the concept of cynical reason in order to capture or understand how they could do this and still maintain a sense of self as good persons. So through procedural correctness, they could feel that rejection of asylum seeker is a perfectly good and just thing to do that does not trouble a sense of being good people. They all knew that the law was not perfect, but they clung to this idea because it was rational from the point of view of their emotive cognitive perceptions of their selves. And I think this raises some issues and problems for the legal system also when it comes to violence in close relations and rape and you name it, which are very hard for this positivist notion of objectivity to deal with. We perform lots of actions simultaneously and we often move between an array of different ongoing actions, right? Without necessarily reflecting on what we feel. That dissonance between feeling what we know and thoughts that enact different feelings is just a kind of clash of practices that can generate personal, social and historical change. In conclusion, cynical reason is not irrational. On the contrary, cynical reason in my elaboration here speaks about the emotive cognitive investments and anchoring of selves in the collectively sustained ideological fantasy that structures shared reality. So as such, cynical reason can be seen as a way to approximate ideals that are always beyond reach. But when growing numbers of people can no longer invest emotive cognitively in the hegemonic ideological fantasy for a number of reasons, shared reality will crack and there will be counter-mobilizations and social change.
In the early days of sociological research on emotion, scholars tended to adopt either an explicitly cultural perspective or a more explicitly structural perspective. The person most often credited with founding the cultural perspective is Arlie Russell Hochschild, who in 1975 argued that a purely cognitive perspective on human life was not sufficient. That is, culturally and historically variable norms defining what should be felt within a particular situation. My own early work on paralegals was an example of the cultural perspective. Relying on data collected from 52 paralegals, the majority of whom were female, I documented 3 behavioral and emotional norms that paralegals co-created amongst themselves in order to manage their feelings. These were professionalism, deference, and caretaking. So the structural perspective is less concerned with the malleability of emotion. They're less concerned with standards of emotional deviance. So instead, they assume that emotions are structurally patterned and legitimate responses to events, outcomes, or circumstances. Many emotions are a function of power and status. So power refers to authority, status refers to prestige. The structural approach, with its focus on reactions as opposed to process of management, is much more likely to be associated with quantitative data in the form of large-scale surveys or experiments, as opposed to the cultural perspective, which tends to rely on ethnography or in-depth interviews. Recently, Robin Simon and her co-author Leda Nath tested cultural expectations, such as women are more emotional than men, against structural expectations, such as emotions arise from social structural conditions. Much to their surprise, considering Robin very much considered herself a cultural sociologist, once socio-demographic variables and social statuses such as marital status, employment, and parenthood were controlled for, gender differences virtually disappeared. The only 2 differences that remained were women's higher levels of self-reported anger, an emotion we culturally ascribe to men in the United States, and distress. I began looking at the same data to see if we could figure out what was going on about women's depression as well as women's anger. Given that the sociodemographics and the social statuses hadn't made a dent in the relationship, we turned our attention to Randall Collins's ritual interaction theory of emotion. And the ritual interaction theory of emotion posits that when anger is intense and enduring, and when there is no recourse for corrective action, that it is likely to transform into depression. Of course, there's also a possibility that individuals who are already distressed may simply be more sensitive to anger-inducing events. However, women do rate happiness and joy as significantly more pleasant and more active than men do. And men rate fear or being afraid as being significantly weaker than do women. So cultural studies point to the importance of studying gender differences. Structural studies consistently find that when structure is controlled, gender differences, typically conceptualized as sex differences, go away. However, structural conditions are real and they rarely go away. One of the reasons I turned to social psych in the first place is because some of them, especially affect control theory, seem to do a better job than either the cultural or the structural perspective in tying or specifying how culture and structure come together in ways that are simultaneous as well as complementary. And indeed, the social psychological research on gender across a variety of spheres, including emotion, suggests that gender differences may, in fact, be the culturally patterned responses to structural conditions. Historically, sociologists have used seemingly competing perspectives to study gender and emotion. Recently, a small group of scholars, myself included, have turned to specific social psychological theories to try to integrate these two approaches. Despite the utility of using formal social psychological theory to guide our understanding, it's probably worth noting that many sociologists who study gender and emotion continue to overlook the potential contributions of formal social psychological theory. Part of the disconnect may have to do with the fact that most of social psychological theory has been derived, specified, and tested in a laboratory settings or using computer simulations. As I hope my own work has revealed, these methodological distinctions may be unnecessary and may even be harmful to our understanding of the social processes of which we are most interested.
Spaces shape feelings, shape spaces. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the argument I want to present today and to discuss with you today. From a history of emotions perspective, this means if we want to understand changes in emotional patterns and practices, then looking at shifting spatial constellations might prove particularly fruitful. I will take the history of male homosexuality in the second half of the 20th century as an example, but empirically I will focus on West Germany. And here one can observe significant emotional shifts around the 1970s. There is a shift from fear and shame to self-assertion and pride, to more open and transparent modes of approaching other men. What you see here is the interior of Café de Paris in West Berlin, Gleisstraße 40. These so carefully described interior design and other details are somewhat reflected in a passage from the interview I did in 2008 with Mr. Meyer, who was born in 1944. And one could not just enter like this. One had to ring a bell. Someone peeked, probably for sure, from the inside through the spy hole and opened the door. The first things that draw attention are the spy hole and the bell. Together with the curtains that many other interviewees from Mr. Meyer's generation mention, these devices try to protect man-loving men from external dangers and allow them to hide in a secluded space. Many sources highlight that curtains, spy holes, and bells, which had turned homophile bars into secluded spaces, completely disappeared in the course of the 1970s. And now, kind of to the contrasting image. The Gay Night 84, organized by the Independent Homosexual Alternative in Hamburg. The night was, quote, totally disco. This crowd was not ordered according to any pattern. One might even say its movements were chaotic. This irregularity corresponded to a spatial setting that featured a large open space where everyone moved on the same level. Here was true, vibrant life. When I visited for the first time, I still remember it was such a disco, relatively spacious. There were easily like 100 gays in this space later on, dancing, great music, fantastic atmosphere, super marvelous, and I thought, that's absolutely fabulous here. I felt it was like a window opening up for me, and I thought, amazing that there is so many gay men. This environment engendered in Mr. Pohl a feeling of belonging that significantly differed from the sense of security and affiliation that the homophile bars generated. And within this new setting, just to mark out the difference, back there from whence a generous gentleman could cautiously greet did not exist any longer, right? Kind of just to highlight the point that that spacious setting made certain practices completely impossible. The dynamics of getting closer to one another and the production of intimacy between men thus implied completely different patterns and practices in the gay disco than they had done in the homophile bars. The analysis thus shows that the changing venues within which men-loving men met impacted their emotional styles on several levels. The 1970s brought a diversification of spaces where men-loving men could meet and live out their emotions in a variety of ways.
So the questions I'm interested in is what happens with our minds and bodies when we go to the movies? How do we engage with film characters and the cinematic environments that surround them? I will give you this image, which is from Mad Max, with the question, how do we perceive and feel about cinematic environments? The other interesting thing that I would have talked about, of course, in the case of this particular Mad Max film, is that it's set in Australia. There are a lot of Australians, especially those who made it overseas, those that people like me would know, that feature the Australian outback prominently as a setting. These beautiful landscape shots. I mean, that's almost a value in itself. That is something, a film like Out of Africa, it was so successful, not only because of its story, but also because of the cinematography it offered. This becomes really front and center when we look at disaster films. And now things get really interesting because you have an active nature. So, I would argue in all of these films, nature is actually, or the environment, I should not just say nature, the environment is much more inclusive. It can also be an urban environment. So the interesting thing about film, of course, is that we only have two senses directly involved, which is sight and sound, so that is direct perception. But then the others, so taste, touch, and smell, are imagined or simulated. So we call that synesthesia, neurologically based phenomenon in which stimulation of one sensory or cognitive pathway leads to automatic, involuntary experience in a second sensory or cognitive pathway. The scene that I showed earlier, this is from Broadway as a Slave, why a whipping scene is can be so hard to digest, especially when it is, as it was the case in this film, really long drawn out, and you're there and you hear the sounds, you have the close-up, so there is when I teach this film, my students regularly, at some point they do this, I see them do this every time you hear the whip, right? They do it inward, they don't even notice. I look at my students when they look at the film, and it's quite interesting to see. Movie theaters occupy a central place in the emotional landscape of the modern world as one of the predominant spaces where societies gather to express and experience feelings. So for them as a movie theater, one of the reasons why you go is in order to have an emotional experience. As whether we experience events in real life, watch them in a movie, or hear or read them about them in a story, we build perceptual and memory representations in the same format.
Foucault argued that a genealogical approach differed from traditional methods of historical inquiry in two key ways. The first, he said, is that a genealogy is comprised of a series of accidents or deviations. The second is that it approaches history not simply through the study of text or documents, but as something inscribed, I quote, in the nervous system, in the temperament, in the digestive apparatus. It appears in faulty respiration, in improper diets, in the debilitated and prostrate bodies of those whose ancestors committed errors. So a genealogy is not simply a history of the body then, or even a bodily history. Its task, writes Foucault, is to expose a body totally imprinted by history and the process of history's destruction of the body. The configuration of the human sensorium that dates back to the start of the industrial period, and which I've approached through the strange case of James Tilley's Matthews and the heirloom, is suggestive of an alternate history of automation in which human bodies are not the passive objects of mechanisation, but willingly enter into intimate and sometimes perverse relationships with machines. This history draws our attention to two key points. Firstly, as noted above, the effective responses and sensations produced by automated technologies are not unmediated, but are rather sites of sensory training. Secondly, that mediation has been driven, at least in part, by our desire to experience new technologies in an embodied way and to explore new forms of intimacy between the bodies and machines that these enabled. To say that affect is mediated by automated technologies in the modern period, as I've attempted to show in this paper, is to recognise the importance of the historical and cultural context in which it is experienced and understood. This does not foreclose on the complexities of the possible relations between them, however, but rather allows us to see this in new ways as part of an effective genealogy that reveals the extent to which queer sensations occupied a central rather than marginal role in the entwined histories of affect and automation.
So I want to start with this quotation. The worst thing about living in extreme poverty is the contempt, that they treat you like you are worthless. Much of the last 150 years of research on poverty is focused on material deprivation, lack of income, lack of the physical things that make for a good life. They've rather ignored the issues of emotion. My understanding of what shame is that it's a self-conscious emotion. It's categorized, it's different from basic emotions. That it's a negative assessment of one's core self, constructed in relation to our own aspirations and the social expectations of others. Western social science teaches us that shame is bad. It leads to so low self-esteem, tends to have negative social and indeed physical consequences. So if one takes a view of most poverty in society is structural, it's unlikely that individual behaviour can address those structural factors. So in a sense, you're imposing shame in a situation where somebody can do nothing about it. Now here's an illustration of where shame is constructed in a positive way. Charles Murray, a right-wing thinker, who argues that stigma is the only way in a free society, that a free society can indeed be generous, and who only ever asks for help when it's really, really essential. Shame is exhibited in the way that we implement policy, in terms of the relationships across the counter, in terms of how social expectations are embedded in the language and expectations of the staff that we employ to engage with people in poverty. However, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to finish just there.
I was doing field research with a colleague. We were aiming to study the impact of decentralisation on local governance in Indonesia. And the first interviews we had were with the sanitation department, and they kept talking about this program where they deliberately use shame to get people to construct their own toilets. Sanitation is one of the biggest development challenges around. There are about 2.5 billion people who don't have access to improved sanitation and 1.2 billion people who open defecate. So the program is one called Community-Led Total Sanitation. The triggering phase involves walks of shame through the villages to do fecal mapping and to explain to people the relationship between faeces and disease. But if they don't do it, the facilitators encourage a system of
fines, taunting and social sanctions to punish those who continue to defecate out in the open. Children being given whistles to go and whistle at people when they find them open defecating. They take pictures of people open defecating and post it on the community notice board. Here's a case study of Cambodia in this recent article because they explicitly rejected the use of shame in CLTS, arguing that it wasn't appropriate in Cambodian society. Participants would sometimes react aggressively if they were too direct. It would be naive and problematic to ignore the wider social cultural implications of Cambodia's trauma, especially when deploying shame into a culture that shows blatant aversion to the technique and has high levels of stress. Microfinance is really central to mainstream development discourse, and community-led total sanitation is said to be now hegemonic in rural sanitation approaches. And what we see is in these two examples the way that not just shame but blaming the poor for their own poverty has become really central to development discourse.